Hello everyone, my name's Coach Tickety, and today we're going to be talking about my DPS tier list for mid-season 4 of Overwatch 2 Competitive. Now, not many changes happened for the DPS roster on this patch. In fact, only 2 of the heroes were actually changed. They were both buffed. Well, one arguably nerfed, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. So even though there aren't many changes to the DPS roster itself, because the game is changing, because this massive Junker Queen buff came through especially, the landscape of Overwatch 2 has changed, so we're going to see some changes on our tier list here as well. And don't forget guys, if you like this type of content, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and if you're looking for more educational content, then you should head over to GameLeap.com. Over there on the website, you'll have access to hundreds of different guides made by our top level coaches, and there's more being added every single week. And did I mention these don't just cover Overwatch, but we've got guides from plenty of other popular games out there as well. These guides will cover everything you need to know about the game to improve and are specifically tailored for players of all skill ranges. So no matter if you're brand new to the game or trying to reach top 500 this season, there's something on our website that can help you reach your goals. So what are you waiting for? Check out that link below the video and get your membership started today. Alright, now we've got a lot of DPS heroes to talk about, so let's jump right in at the bottom of the list in the C tier. These are going to be heroes that I think have their own unique strengths, but are a little bit too situational to be considered truly strong in the current meta. And our first pick here is going to be Pharah. Pharah definitely gets a gold star when it comes to aerial superiority, but there's not enough situations in which you can easily find those types of positions and make use of them to make Pharah any stronger than the C tier here. She often finds her best positions after her team's already won a previous fight, which can be fine. Say for example, first fight on King of the Hill, you can snowball that into a very strong hold with Pharah, but in other map types and in other situations, it can feel very hard to get the ball rolling and actually get that first team fight win so that you can set up properly as Pharah. And unless you've got a dedicated Mercy pocket and the enemy hit scan players aren't too strong with their aiming skills, then you're usually going to have a hard time finding consistent value even in strong positions here. Next up in the C tier is going to be Bastion, and Bastion is simply too easy to counter in most situations because all of his value comes from his one cooldown, his turret form. Anytime he's not transformed, he basically feels like half a hero. He definitely demands a lot of respect based on the amount of damage he can put out in that turret form, but if the enemy team is smart, they'll simply wait you out or poke you out from range to force those cooldowns out earlier and then go all in once you no longer have that configuration available. I will say, however, that Bastion is definitely seeing a rise of popularity right now because of the influence of the brawl type compositions in the meta. With heavy frontliners like Junker Queen, Ramatra, and Reinhardt in the roster becoming more and more popular in play, Bastion can definitely bully all of those types of frontline tanks out of the way with his turret form, but once again, without that cooldown available, he's usually the one getting run over instead. Next up here is going to be Genji, who's still, unfortunately, all the way down here in the C tier. Genji does good damage, he's got a great all-in potential, and his ultimate is one of the strongest DPS ultimates in the game for making plays with, but his aggression is way too situational and it's way too easy to get punished for going aggressive on Genji compared to some other flankers like say Tracer or Sombra. On those heroes, you're always just one button away from relative safety with your recall or your translocator. Genji unfortunately doesn't have that luxury, which leads to him being punished way more often than any other flanker in the game. Now, if you can master your mechanics on Genji, you can be one of the most lethal DPS characters in the entire game, but that is a very steep learning curve and a very high skill ceiling we're talking about, so if you're not 100% confident with your skills on Genji, I would usually recommend picking up a different hero. Next up is going to be Torbjorn, and Torb is great at being an anti-flanker, zone-controlling type of hero. He's even a little bit tankier for a backline member, but he doesn't offer a lot when it comes to creating new angles or any kinds of offensive pressure when your team is trying to make space. The predictable nature of your turrets and the projectile of your primary fire makes Torbjorn's damage very inconsistent, which is not exactly what you're looking for when you're trying to break into a new location on the map. Torbjorn's great at playing it low and slow, but Overwatch can be a very fast game and sometimes feels like he can't keep up with it. Next, we're going to talk about another turret hero, Symmetra. And I was debating between the B and C tier for Symmetra. She's definitely stronger in a lot more of a general sense than some of these other C tier heroes, but again, she is very situational and somewhat easy to counter in a game of Overwatch. Symmetra's playmaking usually revolves around either ramping up close range damage alongside a heavy frontliner like a brawl tank like Reinhardt or Ramatra, or around catching her opponents off guard with turret locations and TP plays. The problem with brawling in the front line as Symmetra is that you are very squishy and you require a lot of resources before you can really start doing some serious damage, and with this meta having so much damage flying around with tanks like Junkrat Queen entering the front line, it's very hard to stay alive for long enough as Symmetra to get real value here. And that second, more flashy playstyle of going for set plays with turrets and TP bombs and things like that is great for catching unsuspecting opponents off guard, but as soon as they start paying a little bit more attention to you, start scouting out your positions and playing around the teleporter, it's not that difficult for enemies to counter this playstyle as well. So yeah, Sim's just a little bit too squishy and a little bit too inconsistent in this meta for me to consider her strong right now. Moving up into the B tier, these heroes I think are absolutely fine to play right now. I think they have very keen strengths and they are worth picking up, but they might not be as overpowered as some of the other heroes in the roster. These are the generally balanced middle of the pack heroes. Our first hero here is going to be Ashe. Ashe is a great pseudo-sniper type hero. She doesn't have the one-shot potential of some other snipers in the roster, but she has other abilities to make up for that fact. She's still very effective at medium to long ranges, and she's got her coach gun for mobility and dynamite for that AoE pressure. Overall, Ashe is definitely a solid choice right now, but there are some times where having that long reload animation and not quite having a one-shot potential means you might wish you were playing a different hero. Next up here is going to be Junkrat, who actually just got buffed in this patch. The damage on his concussion mine is going up by 10. This means that his one-shot combo of hitting a grenade followed by an immediate concussion mine is going to be much more consistent to hit. Junkrat's in a pretty good spot right now, especially in a brawl-focused meta. He puts out a ton of easy damage into the front line, but because of his damage being so inconsistent on those long traveling projectiles, it can be hard to really finish some of the kills that Junkrat's trying to set up. The most consistent way that Junkrat players will find those eliminations is by getting creative and getting up close to make those one-shot combos happen, but that is much riskier and has a much higher skill ceiling to it. So Junkrat's absolutely great right now if all you need is some safe pressure into the front line, maybe into the enemy tank, but you're going to get outranged by some other heroes and outflanked by heroes with more mobility, so you need to make sure you're keeping up with those playstyles yourself, which can be a hard ask for Junkrat. Next hero here is going to be Cassidy, and ever since that patch a little while ago that brought him more in line with other DPS heroes by reducing his max HP and taking away some damage on his magnetic grenade, Cassidy has felt like a very average DPS character. That doesn't mean he's bad, but it doesn't mean he's overpowered or extremely strong either. He's got very consistent damage and decent range as well, but he is limited by his mobility and his tend to want to get close to his targets for him to hit those fan the hammers or of course those magnetic grenades. Overall, I'd say Cassidy's a very honest DPS hero right now because if you can catch someone off guard, you'll almost always win the duel, provided that you can hit your shots, but if someone catches you off guard, you don't really have a bunch of defensive tools that will keep yourself alive or get out of there for free. So while he's definitely a strong hero, you do need to watch your positioning on Cassidy because you don't want to get roped into a duel you didn't ask for. Next up is going to be Reaper, who I think is actually a fairly strong hero right now, but he's not doing well in terms of how he fares against the current meta. Reaper definitely packs a punch against any frontline hero in close range, but when the frontliners include brawl tanks like Junkrat Queen, Reinhardt, or Ramatra, they tend to punch back even harder. This can make it very hard for a Reaper player to truly keep up in a brawl-focused matchup, and instead you'll want to find ways around the front line and into some squishier members into the back line in this case. But in those situations, you might feel limited by your lack of flexible mobility since your teleport is nice and all, but it is very telegraphed. Overall, Reaper's still going to be your go-to pick if you want to try and out-damage aggressive dive tanks like Winston or Wrecking Ball, but in other situations, especially in a brawl, you might find yourself swapping off Reaper more often. Next up is Echo, who also received some changes this patch. The cost of her ultimate is going down by 25%, that is massive. However, her ultimate generation during her ultimate, once she's copied a new hero, is going down from a 5.5 times multiplier down to a 4 times multiplier. Overall, I'm going to call this a buff, even though it can be much harder to charge up your copy target ultimate. The fact that you can get into a duplicate more often now, 25% more often to be exact, is a pretty huge change for Echo. I'd say overall this is a very nice buff that makes her a much more viable hero. But of course she is still down here in the B tier for a reason. This duplicate buff is nice, but definitely doesn't make her overpowered by any means. I like to think of Echo as a bit of a hybrid between Pharah with her aerial mobility and Genji with his all-in assassination potential. But when compared side by side, Echo has more consistent damage at range than Pharah does and has a more consistent all-in burst combo than Genji with her focusing beam. It's also safer to go for because she can literally fly around. This sounds like an absolute ton of potential on a single hero, however, finding those situations is the hard part, and if you don't find them fast enough, you'll often find yourself falling behind on Echo, and even with a faster duplicate charge, that isn't usually enough to turn the fight in your favor. Next hero here is going to be Sombra, who I usually think of as a counter pick type hero. You don't usually open up with a Sombra, you use Sombra to deal with specific threats on the enemy team, like a Wrecking Ball or a Doomfist or even an enemy Widowmaker that you can get on top of. But even if she's not actively countering a specific hero on the enemy team, or maybe she was but they swapped off of it, Sombra still does fairly well on her own in an average lobby. Using stealth to sneak around the map and open up new angles for yourself and for your team is a great tool, especially against heroes who are focused in single areas of the map, like for example a brawl type composition. Just being able to get behind a composition like that consistently is a very strong ability for Sombra, since you'll be able to pull the enemy team in two separate directions once you start fighting. Unfortunately, even if she can get there consistently, Sombra can't always finish the deal whilst in that position, since her using her translocator takes her completely out of the fight, and her damage isn't as strong as some other flankers like say Tracer. Your EMP is a great ultimate for getting that job done when you really need it to, but you also need to be able to function in between your ultimates here, so Sombra can definitely struggle in those areas. B tier for now. Alright, now moving up into the A tier, these are heroes that I believe are some of the strongest in the game right now, and if you can play them, then you should. First up is going to be Widowmaker. Everyone who's ever played any FPS game knows the frustration of going against a talented sniper. Widowmaker's threat at range is unmatched by any other hero in the roster currently. And when you pair that with the fact that dive heroes are falling out of favor with the rise of Junker Queen and other brawl type heroes, and Widowmaker has a lot more time and space to work with to line up her shots these days. Now obviously you can't play Widowmaker on every map or in every composition, you need to know when exactly to pull her out to find the most value on her, but in the right hands and in the right situations, Widowmaker players will absolutely take over the lobby, and it feels like the enemy team has nothing they can do besides try and pick Widowmaker themselves. Next up is going to be Sojourner, and I'm still fully in the camp that Sojourner is probably a bit overpowered these days because she just has so many tools in her toolkit, but for now she's not quite an S tier hero because she is very mechanically demanding if you want to get the most value out of her. She's got her primary fire that can spam damage long range, a lot like many other backline members, but she also has sniper-like precision on her railgun, which can almost one-shot, or actually one-shot if you have a nice mercy pocket, while also having very strong mobility for this type of hero. She has the best mobility for any backliner in the game. And on top of all of that, she also has her ultimate Overclock, which I would say is an even stronger playmaking tool than Genji's Dragonblade. Sojourner just has a little bit, or maybe just a lot of everything, and if you put the time in, you will be rewarded on this hero. Definitely worth picking up. Next hero here is going to be Soldier 76. Not quite as flashy as Sojourner, of course, but a lot more consistent and a much lower skill floor. Even though he doesn't have any one-shot potential to find eliminations, the constant, unrelenting pressure of his pulse rifle, even into tanks, is something that the enemy team cannot ignore, and it means that Soldier is almost always finding value in one way or another. He's also a very safe pick because his mobility and self-healing allow him to play very independently, and he can usually respond to any threats that come his way just by running in the opposite direction. If you want to get the absolute most value out of Soldier, you'll need to know how to time and position your flanks, especially when you're going for those tack visor plays, but overall, even if you're just sitting in the backline holding down your trigger, you'll be finding good value as Soldier. It's pretty hard not to. Next DPS pick here is going to be Mei, a bit of a difference compared to these snipers and backliners we've been talking about. Like I've been mentioning, the rise of brawl meta is here, with the likes of Junker Queen, Reinhardt, and Ramatra leading the charge more often than not, and the team with a Mei and a brawl mirror is usually the winning team. If you've been playing the game since Overwatch 1, then you might understand that Mei functions a little bit like an off tank. She can enable aggressive plays from her tank, or she can disable aggressive plays from the enemy tank. In either case, your tank starts winning the more pressure you put out on Mei. This is done mainly by the utility of her wall to isolate or deny sightlines to an enemy team, but her close range freezing beam, her icicles, and even her cryo freeze are all excellent tools for keeping up and finding pressure in a brawl situation. Mei isn't the greatest at keeping up with fast-paced individuals in a dive-based setting or poking people out at range with her icicles, so you won't always be finding the best value as Mei. You might need to swap off depending on the compositions you're playing with or against, but in this current meta, Mei finds a ton of value and I highly recommend you try her out. Next up in the A tier is going to be Hanzo, and I was very close to putting Hanzo in the S tier, but I don't think he's quite there yet. With long-range one-shot potential, close-range burst damage, overall very consistent pressure, and even halfway decent mobility, Hanzo seems to have it all. It's just all locked behind a projectile-based weapon. Since projectiles have that travel time that make them a little bit harder to aim, it's not uncommon for Hanzo to be out-dueled by people with mobility or out-sniped by hit-scan members in the backline. But once you're able to master the bow that Hanzo wields, he truly is one of the most well-rounded DPS in the entire game. He works well on pretty much any map and with or against pretty much any different composition. Just once again, it can feel like sometimes your projectiles just won't hit, your aim is just a little bit off, and you haven't quite hit those lucky numbers on the slot machine for you to find those kills. And with that, we'll move up to the only hero I've placed up in the S tier. It's going to be Tracer. I think Tracer's an S tier hero because not only is she incredibly strong right now, she's got a ton of individual skill expression, she's very hard to counter if it's possible at all, and she can be played very effectively at every single skill level. Tracer functions as a flanker who likes to take over the map and get onto squishy backliners before winning a duel against them. But unlike other flankers in the roster like Genji or Sombra or even Reaper, Tracer gets to stay aggressive even after she gets looked at or forced out of a fight. So compared to, say, Genji or Reaper, after they use their cooldowns, they have to wait for them to come back or usually run back to a support before they can do anything else. Same thing goes for Sombra. Whenever she translocates away, she's usually a very far distance away from the team fight and has to get set up again, put a new translocator down before she finds her next target. Tracer can often get in and out of a fight without even burning her most important cooldown, her recall. But then even with her recall down, despite being a very squishy hero, she's incredibly hard to pin down because of the flexibility of her blinks. This means that Tracer can embody that flanker playstyle of getting aggressive sneakily and bursting down your targets one by one without losing the consistency that usually you only find in backline members. In coaching terms, this means that Tracer has virtually zero downtime when played properly. She can almost always be doing something more aggressive or setting up for something in the future, whereas other DPS will have to sit back and wait for their cooldowns to come back. I could probably do a 2-hour video essay about how strong Tracer is just as a hero in general in Overwatch 2 right now, but if you've played her yourself or you've played against a competent Tracer on the enemy team, you already know what I'm talking about. Tracer can feel unstoppable, uncounterable, unkillable, while still being one of the most effective and lethal members in the entire DPS roster. In my mind, there's simply no other heroes that can match Tracer's potential, so that's why she's up here all by herself in the S tier. But those are just my opinions. That rounds out my tier list for all the DPS heroes in Overwatch 2. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know down in the comments, what did I get wrong? Where would you have placed different heroes? I know I've definitely got maybe more than a few hot takes here, but this is just based on my experience, how I view the game. So let me know what you guys think. But anyway, that's going to be it for me today, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you in the next one.